He will be your salvation, Alistair. A true Blackwood heir. The words of his mother, the Dowager Duchess Isolde Beaumont, echoed in the cavernous silence of his study. They were meant to be a balm, a promise of renewal after years of hollowness. A new wife, a new hope, a son to secure the ancient line. Society pages were already whispering, toasting the future Duke of Blackwood before he was even conceived. But Alistair felt no salvation. He felt only the familiar, suffocating weight of his title, of the cold stone walls of his life. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the firelight catching on the heavy gold of his signet ring. The wolf's head carved into the black onyx seemed to mock him, a symbol of a ferocity he had never truly possessed. He had been a predator once, he thought, but only for a moment that had cost him everything. 5 years. 5 years since he had last seen Eleanor, not in a ballroom, shimmering in silk and diamonds, but standing on the cold flagstones of the great hall, her face a mask of pale, silent shock. He had thrown the words at her like stones, words fed to him by his mother, words backed by the damning evidence of a perfumed letter. Traitor, adulteress. He had stripped her of her name, her home, her dignity, and cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. His pride had demanded it. His mother had orchestrated it. And he, the powerful Duke of Blackwood, had been nothing more than a puppet. The truth had been a slow, creeping poison. It began with the emptiness of his house, a silence that even his second, ill-fated wife could not fill. Lady Cecilia had been his mother's choice, a placid, pretty thing who had faded from life as quietly as she had entered it, leaving the ducal nursery as empty as before. It was after her passing that the doubts began to fester. A chance remark from a former servant, a slip of the tongue from his mother in a moment of triumph, small, jagged pieces that did not fit the smooth, clean narrative of Eleanor's betrayal. So he had hired a man, a discreet agent named Davies, who specialized in uncovering secrets the aristocracy preferred to keep buried. For months, there was nothing. Then, a week ago, a letter had arrived. It spoke of a small, wind-battered fishing village on the coast named Seabrook. It spoke of a woman living in a rented room above a bakery, a woman named Elena, who mended fishing nets and sold wildflowers to the sparse summer visitors. A woman with haunted, familiar eyes, and a quiet grace that did not belong in a place that smelled perpetually of salt and brine. A woman with a son, a boy of about 5 years, a boy with his father's eyes. The amber liquid trembled in Alistair's glass. He drained it in one searing gulp, the burn in his throat a pathetic echo of the fire in his soul. Salvation. His mother spoke of a future heir when his firstborn, his true heir, was selling flowers for pennies outside a crumbling stone church. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He was not a victim of betrayal. He was the architect of it. And penance, he knew with a terrifying certainty, was a far harsher master than pride. The sea air was a thief. It stole the warmth from your bones and the breath from your lungs, leaving behind the raw, wet scent of salt and decay. Eleanor had grown used to it. She no longer noticed the damp that clung to her woolen shawl or the persistent chill that seeped through the floorboards of her small room. It was simply the texture of her life now, as coarse and unyielding as the calluses on her palms. She stood at the edge of the churchyard, her basket of sea pinks and wild lavender resting on the low stone wall. The Sunday service had just ended, and the small congregation trickled out, their faces pinched by piety and the biting wind. A few of the women offered her tight, pitying smiles. They knew her as Elena, the quiet widow with the little boy, a woman with no past and a meager present. They did not see the Duchess of Blackwood. That woman had died 5 years ago, in the cold, echoing hall of a grand house, under the weight of a lie she was given no chance to refute. "Mama?" A small hand tugged at her skirt. Thomas looked up at her, his small face serious, his gray eyes so like his father's it was a constant, bittersweet ache in her chest. The Blackwood eyes that could command a room with a single glance, or turn to chips of ice in a heartbeat. In her son, they were wide and trusting, full of a world that consisted of his mother, the sea, and the stories she told him at night. "Did you sell any?" he asked, his voice a hopeful whisper. She smiled, the expression feeling stiff on her face. "Not yet, my love, but the day is young." He nodded, accepting this as he accepted everything, with a simple, unwavering faith in her. He held up a small, crudely carved wooden wolf, its shape worn smooth by the constant clutch of his hand. She had carved it for him one winter, her knife shaping the memory of the crest on a man's ring, a subconscious act of remembrance she could not explain or prevent. A heavy carriage, gleaming like a black beetle even under the sullen gray sky, rumbled to a stop at the end of the lane. It was an alien sight in Seabrook, where the only vehicles were fish carts and the occasional farmer's wagon. The villagers stared, their curiosity piqued. Eleanor felt a prickle of unease, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the wind. Such carriages belonged to another world, her world, the world that had tried to erase her. The door opened. A man stepped out. Time seemed to slow, the sounds of the sea and the gulls fading to a distant hum. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulder. The years had sharpened the lines of his face, carving away the last vestiges of youth and leaving behind the hard, uncompromising angles of a man forged by power and regret. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored coat that seemed to absorb the meager light. His gaze swept over the churchyard, dismissing the curious onlookers, searching. Then his eyes found her, and they stopped. Eleanor froze. The basket of flowers suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The air she had learned to breathe felt thin and sharp in her lungs. It was him, Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, her husband, the man who had destroyed her. He took a step, then another, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he were approaching a startled animal. The ground between them, a few dozen yards of damp grass and weathered headstones, felt like a chasm. She could feel the stares of the villagers, a burning weight on her skin. Their quiet widow was being approached by a lord. The story of her life was unraveling before their eyes. Thomas, sensing the sudden tension in her, pressed closer against her leg. "Mama, who is that man?" Eleanor could not answer. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears and unspoken accusations. She saw the shock in Alistair's eyes, the dawning comprehension as his gaze dropped from her face to the small boy hiding in the folds of her skirt. He saw the child's face. He saw the eyes. Alistair felt the world tilt on its axis. The report from Davies had prepared him for the possibility, but the reality was a physical blow. The boy. He was real. A living, breathing miniature of himself, with the same slate-gray eyes that stared back at him from his own reflection every morning. The child clutched his mother's skirt, peering at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, and in his other hand he held a small wooden wolf, the symbol of House Beaumont. The air crackled with 5 years of silence, 5 years of pain, of hardship, of a lie that had grown into a monstrous, living thing. Alistair saw it all in the woman standing before him. This was not the Duchess he had married. The soft, hesitant girl was gone. In her place stood a woman honed to a fine, sharp edge by survival. Her hands, resting protectively on her son's shoulder, were not the smooth, pale hands of an aristocrat. They were reddened, chapped, the hands of a woman who worked. There were faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but beneath them was a core of steel he had never seen before. He had tried to break her, and instead, he had made her unbreakable. The realization was a fresh wave of shame. He stopped a few feet away, the distance feeling both too far and too close. What could he possibly say? "I am sorry" was a pathetic insult, I was wrong was a confession of his own monumental foolishness. I have come for my son was a declaration of war. He settled on the only thing he could manage, his voice rough, unused. Eleanor! Her name on his lips was a trespass. She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. Her own voice, when it came, was as cold and sharp as a shard of sea ice. "What do you want, Your Grace?" The title was a slap, a deliberate, calculated strike. She was reminding him of the gulf between them, the power he had wielded so carelessly. She was no longer Eleanor, his wife. She was a stranger, and he was an intruder, a duke trespassing in the life she had painstakingly built from the ruins of the one he had demolished. He looked from her hardened face to the wide, questioning eyes of his son. His son. The words repeated in his mind, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He had a son, a 5-year-old boy who had lived his entire life in poverty, while his father languished in empty luxury. I know, he began, his voice failing him. He cleared his throat, forcing the words out. I know I have no right to be here, no right to speak to you. But I had to see. I had to know if it was true. Her laugh was not a sound of mirth. It was a brittle, broken thing, devoid of all warmth. True? What is true, Your Grace? That a woman you cast into the street managed not to die? Or that she had the audacity to bear your son in secret? The son you never wanted? That is not true, he said, the words sharp with a defensiveness that rang hollow even to his own ears. I never knew. You never asked, she retorted, her voice rising, drawing more stares from the lingering villagers. You never looked. You saw a letter. You listened to your mother's poison, and you passed sentence. You were the judge, the jury, and the executioner, Alistair. Did you ever, for one single moment, think to ask your wife if the accusations were true? He had no answer, because she was right. He had not asked. He had not wanted to know. It had been easier to believe the lie, to feed his wounded pride on the pyre of her reputation. It had been easier than confronting the cold, manipulative presence of his own mother and the suffocating emptiness of his marriage. He took a half-step forward, his hands open in a gesture of supplication he had never made in his life. Eleanor, I can explain. I was deceived. We were both deceived. Deceived? She shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. You were relieved. Do not try to rewrite history now. You found a convenient excuse to be rid of a wife you never loved. Now, 5 years later, you appear in your gleaming carriage. Why? Has your new wife failed to provide the requisite heir? Did you come to inspect the bastard and see if he is fit to carry the name you denied him? Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking at the heart of his guilt. He flinched, the truth of her accusations scalding him. Cecilia is gone, he said quietly. She died 2 years ago. For the first time, a flicker of something other than contempt crossed Eleanor's face, a shadow of the empathy that had once been her defining characteristic. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a weary resolve. I am sorry for your loss, she said, the words a formal courtesy, nothing more. But it changes nothing. Thomas and I have a life here. It is not the life you are accustomed to, but it is ours. We do not need you. He is my son, Alistair said, the words raw, possessive. It was the wrong thing to say. He knew it the moment the words left his lips. Her chin lifted, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective fire he had only ever seen in cornered animals. He is my son. I am the one who carried him, who bore him alone in a cold room with only a midwife for help. I am the one who worked until my hands bled to ensure he had food in his belly and a roof over his head. I am the one who stayed up through fevers, who taught him his letters, who held him when he had nightmares. Where were you, Your Grace? You were at Blackwood. counting your fortunes and mourning your wounded pride. You have no claim here." Thomas, who had been listening with a child's solemn intensity, finally spoke. He pointed a small, grubby finger at Alistair's chest. "You have a wolf," he said, his voice clear and piping. He was looking at the signet ring. Alistair looked down at his own hand as if seeing the ring for the first time. He knelt, slowly, awkwardly, bringing himself down to the boy's level. The damp grass soaked through the knee of his expensive trousers. He did not care. He was looking into his son's face, a perfect, heartbreaking blend of his own features and Eleanor's finer bone structure. "Yes," Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is the crest of my family." Thomas held up his own small wooden wolf. "I have a wolf too. Mama made him for me." The sight of the crudely carved toy, so lovingly made, so imbued with a memory she had tried to bury, shattered the last of Alistair's composure. This was the proof of her lingering connection, a tie she had not managed to sever, a testament to a son who was his in every conceivable way. He looked up at Eleanor, his eyes pleading. "Please," he whispered, "do not send me away. Let me try to make this right." Eleanor's face was a mask of stone. The hurt was too deep, the wound too old. Trust, once broken, did not mend so easily. She pulled Thomas back, putting her body between her son and the man who was his father. "Go back to your world, Your Grace," she said, her voice flat, final. "There is nothing for you here." He did not go. He watched her turn, her back ramrod straight, and walk away, her small son trotting to keep up. He watched her disappear into the narrow, winding street that led to the bakery, leaving him kneeling alone in the damp churchyard, the object of a dozen curious stares. The Duke of Blackwood, brought to his knees by a woman selling flowers and a boy with his eyes. He rose, his joints stiff, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He would not go back. He could not. To leave now would be to abandon his son a second time, a sin he knew he could not survive. He had passed sentence on Eleanor 5 years ago. Now he would accept hers. He would stay. He would endure the cold, the discomfort, the humiliation. He would remain in this forgotten corner of the world until he had earned the right to speak his son's name. The Salty Dog Inn was precisely as grim as its name suggested. Alistair's room was small, with a lumpy mattress, a single grimy window that offered a view of a brick wall, and the pervasive scent of stale ale and fried fish. It was a far cry from the silk sheets and cavernous chambers of Blackwood Manor. It was perfect. It was a tangible representation of his disgrace, a fitting setting for the start of his penance. He sent his carriage and driver away, an act that caused the innkeeper no small amount of consternation. A duke did not simply dismiss his carriage. A duke did not take a room with a shared privy at the end of the hall. Alistair paid the man double his rate for a month in advance, a move that replaced suspicion with a greedy sort of tolerance. For the first few days, he did nothing but watch. He was a ghost in his own life's story, an observer of the world he had created through his cruelty. From his window, he could just see the corner where Eleanor stood, with her flowers each morning. He saw her interact with the townspeople, a quiet word here, a small, reserved smile there. She was a part of this community, woven into its fabric. He was a foreign object, jarring and out of place. He saw Thomas. The boy was a whirlwind of energy, chasing gulls on the muddy flats when the tide was out, helping his mother tie her small bouquets with bits of twine. Alistair's chest ached with a terrible, hollow longing. He wanted to hear his son's laughter up close, not as a faint echo on the wind. He wanted to know what stories he liked, what his favorite color was, whether he was afraid of the dark. He was a stranger to his own child. He began to walk. He walked the narrow streets of Seabrook, his fine leather boots coated in mud and fish scales. The villagers stared. They whispered behind their hands. The formidable Duke of Blackwood was now just the strange lord at the inn. He learned their faces, their routines. He saw the hardship in the lines around their eyes, the weariness in their shoulders. This was the world Eleanor had survived in. Not just survived, but found a place. He had cast her from a gilded cage into a place of grim reality, and she had somehow found more freedom here than she ever had at his side. One afternoon, he saw Mrs. Gable, Eleanor's landlady, struggling with a heavy barrel of flour outside the bakery. The woman was stout and red-faced, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Without thinking, Alistair strode forward. "Allow me, madam," he said, his voice startling her. She looked him up and down, her eyes wary. "Don't need no help from fine lords." "Nevertheless," he insisted, and before she could protest further, he hefted the barrel. It was heavier than he'd expected, the rough wood digging into his soft hands. He carried it into the back of the shop, the warm, sweet smell of yeast and sugar, a stark contrast to the salty air outside. He set the barrel down with a thud. Mrs. Gable stared at him, her suspicion warring with a grudging respect. "Well, didn't think you had it in you, Your Grace." "I am stronger than I look," he said, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "Elena is a good woman," the baker's wife said abruptly, wiping her floury hands on her apron. "A good mother. She's had a hard time of it. Whatever you're here for, you be careful you don't make it harder." It was a warning, a simple, clear statement of allegiance from one of Eleanor's allies. Alistair nodded, humbled. "That is the last thing I wish to do." He began to make small, anonymous overtures. He saw that Eleanor's shawl was thin and frayed, so he purchased the finest, warmest wool shawl from the town's only draper, and had a young boy leave it on her doorstep. He saw her returning late one evening, her basket empty, her face etched with exhaustion, and knew she and Thomas might go hungry. The next morning, a crate of fresh produce, cheese, and a smoked ham from a farm inland was delivered to Mrs. Gable, with instructions that it was for her tenants. Eleanor knew it was him. She knew it, and it infuriated her. These were the gestures of a wealthy man, attempts to salve a guilty conscience with coin. It was the way of his world, to throw money at a problem until it went away. She was not a problem to be solved. She was a woman he had wronged, and her forgiveness could not be purchased. She confronted him one evening as he was returning to the inn. She stood in the middle of the cobbled street, blocking his path, her eyes blazing in the dim light of the gas lamps. "Stop it!" she commanded, her voice low and furious. He feigned ignorance. "Stop what?" "The gifts, the food, the charity. I'm not your pet project, Alistair. I do not want your money. I have managed for 5 years without it. I will continue to manage." "It is not charity," he said, his own frustration rising. "It is providing for our son. He is not your son in any way that matters. You have not earned that title. You are a biological fact, nothing more. A ghost. Do you think a ham can replace 5 years of absence? Does a wool shawl make up for a mother's terror, wondering how she will keep her child warm through the winter?" "No," he admitted, his voice dropping. "No, of course not. But I have to do something. I cannot stand by and watch you both struggle." "This is not a struggle," she shot back, her pride a fierce, bright shield. "This is my life, the one I chose, the one I made. You may find it wanting, Your Grace, but I do not. I have my son. I have my dignity. That is more than I ever had at Blackwood." She turned to leave, but he reached out, his hand closing gently around her arm. It was the first time he had touched her in 5 years. A jolt, hot and sharp, shot through them both. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. His touch was not forceful, but it was firm, a silent plea. "Eleanor, wait," he said, his voice raw. "I have sent for Davies, the man who found you. He is bringing proof Proof of what my mother did. He found the secretary she used, a man named Finch. He confessed everything. How she dictated the letter. How she paid him to forge the handwriting. It was all a lie. A monstrous, calculated lie to separate us. Eleanor stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to dismiss it, to call him a liar, but she saw the desperate sincerity in his eyes. She saw the pain, the self-loathing. He was not the same man who had condemned her. That man had been cold, arrogant, certain. This man was broken. She pulled her arm from his grasp, the place where he had touched her tingling with a confusing mixture of warmth and resentment. Proof changes the facts, Alistair. It does not change the past. It does not change what you did. You believed her. You did not believe me. She walked away, leaving him standing alone in the dark street. But for the first time, a hairline crack appeared in the wall of her certainty. A lie. It had all been a lie. She had known it, of course, in her own heart. But the idea that he now knew it too, that he was trying to unravel it, was a dangerous, unsettling thought. It threatened the simple, hard-won peace of her anger. A week later, Mr. Davies arrived. He was a small, unassuming man with spectacles and a quiet demeanor that belied a mind as sharp as a razor. He met Alistair at the inn, handing over a thick portfolio of documents. Inside was a sworn affidavit from the former secretary, Mr. Finch, detailing the Dowager Duchess's entire scheme. It named the forger she had hired to mimic the handwriting of a certain lord known for his indiscretions. It detailed the payments, the threats, the cold, clinical way Isolde had plotted the destruction of her own son's marriage to remove a daughter-in-law she deemed unsuitable. Armed with the proof, Alistair knew he could not delay. He had to confront his mother. He had to dismantle the web of lies at its source. He found Eleanor at the churchyard, packing up her few remaining flowers at the end of the day. Thomas was sitting on the wall, kicking his heels, the little wooden wolf in his lap. Alistair approached them quietly. "I have to go away for a few days," he said, his voice low. "I am returning to Blackwood." Eleanor's head snapped up, a flicker of something. Was it disappointment? In her eyes before she masked it. "Of course. Your life is there." "No," he said firmly. "My life is here, with my son. But I have to do this. I have to face her. For you. For Thomas. To clear your name, officially and forever." He held out the portfolio. "This is a copy of the proof. Everything is in here. Read it, please, while I am gone." He placed the package on the stone wall beside her. He looked at Thomas, a painful lump forming in his throat. He wanted to say something to the boy. But what? "I am your father, and I am leaving, but I will be back." The words were clumsy, inadequate. Instead, he simply met the boy's curious gray eyes. "I will bring you back a proper wolf," he said softly. "One made of the finest wood in the Blackwood forests." Thomas clutched his own small wolf tighter. "I like my wolf," he said, with the simple, devastating loyalty of a child. "Mama made it." Alistair nodded, his heart constricting. "Yes," he said, "of course you do." He turned and walked away without looking back, the boy's words a fresh reminder of the mountain he still had to climb. He was not just fighting a lie from the past. He was fighting a bond forged in love and hardship that had no room for him. The drive to Blackwood was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every ancient oak, every rolling hill, was a reminder of a life that now felt like a hollow sham. When he arrived, the manor seemed larger, colder, more imposing than he remembered. It was a mausoleum of pride and tradition. He found his mother in the drawing room, taking tea, surrounded by the opulent splendor she commanded. She looked up as he entered, a cool, satisfied smile on her face. She believed he had returned to his senses, ready to discuss the matter of a new wife. "Alistair," she said, her voice smooth as polished marble, I was beginning to worry. This sojourn in that dreadful little fishing village was becoming unseemly. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He walked to the center of the room and tossed the portfolio of documents onto the delicate table in front of her. Tea sloshed from the porcelain cups, staining the priceless lace. Isolde stared at the file, then up at him, her eyes narrowing. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Mother, is that the lies are over," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I have a sworn confession from Finch. I know about the forger. I know about the payments. I know that you systematically, and with malice, destroyed my wife and hid my son from me for 5 years." The color drained from her face. For a moment she looked old, fragile, but it passed, replaced by a familiar, steely defiance. "That woman was not worthy of the Blackwood name. She was weak. I did what was necessary to protect this family, to protect you from your own foolish sentimentality." "Protect me?" His voice rose to a roar, the sound echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. "You mutilated my life. You let me believe my wife was an adulteress. You let me live in an empty, silent hell of my own making, while my own son, my heir, grew up in poverty. You speak of the Blackwood name? You have dragged it through the most despicable mire of deceit and cruelty." "I did it for the lineage," she cried, rising to her feet, her composure cracking. "For the future of this house." "This house is stone and wood," he thundered, sweeping a vase of hothouse lilies from a pedestal. It shattered on the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. "A family is blood and bone and love and trust. Things you know nothing about. You did not do this for the lineage. You did it for yourself, for your own power, your own control. You could not stand to see me happy with a woman you had not chosen, a woman you could not manipulate." He advanced on her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Eleanor is 10 times the woman you are. She survived what you did to her. She raised my son with love and dignity in the face of impossible hardship. She is the strongest person I have ever known. And you are nothing but a withered, jealous creature, hiding in a palace built on lies." Tears of rage and humiliation streamed down Isolde's face. "You cannot speak to me this way. I am your mother. I am the Dowager Duchess." "You are a stranger to me," he said, his voice dropping back to an icy calm. "And as of this moment, you are no longer the mistress of this house. You will pack your things. You will be removed to the dower house in Northumbria. It is remote, and you will find the society there lacking. You will have a generous allowance, but you will have no authority. You will not contact me. You will never, ever attempt to contact my wife or my son. If you do, I will cut you off without a shilling and make this entire sordid affair public. Your name, the one you prize so highly, will be ruined forever. Am I understood?" She stared at him, speechless, her face contorted with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He had finally broken the chains. He was no longer her puppet. He was the Duke of Blackwood, in truth as well as in name. He turned his back on her, not waiting for an answer. He walked to her private secretary desk, the place where she had spun her webs, and began to search. He did not know what he was looking for, but his instincts drove him. In a locked bottom drawer, hidden beneath a false bottom, he found it. A small, lacquered box. Inside was a stack of papers, and there, on the top, was a sheet of Eleanor's own stationery, covered in aborted attempts to forge a phrase from the letter, and beneath it, a draft of the vile letter itself, in his mother's own sharp, angry script. The final, damning proof. He took it, a cold sense of victory settling in his heart. It was over. The lie was officially dead. He returned to Seabrook 2 days later. The autumn sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the harbor. He did not go to the inn. He walked directly to the bakery, the box containing the final proof clutched in his hand. He found Eleanor in the small, walled garden behind the building, hanging laundry on a line. The setting sun caught the gold in her hair, and for a moment she looked like the girl he had married before the world had hardened her. Thomas was at her feet, carefully arranging a line of seashells on a stone step. She looked up as his shadow fell over her. She saw his face, the grim resolution in it, and knew that something had irrevocably changed. He did not speak at first. He simply walked to her and held out the box. "The final proof," he said. "The original draft, in her own hand." She took the box, her fingers trembling slightly. She opened it and looked at the paper. She saw her own stationery, the aborted forgeries. She saw the Dowager Duchess's handwriting, the cruel, sharp letters forming the words that had condemned her. A shudder racked her body. It was one thing to know you were the victim of a lie. It was another to see the architecture of it laid bare. "She is gone," Alistair said quietly, "banished to the most remote dower house we own. She will never interfere in our lives again. Blackwood is yours now, Eleanor, to run as you see fit, to make into a home, not a prison." Eleanor looked up from the damning letter, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, not tears of sadness, but of a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. The fight was over. The monster had been vanquished, but the scars remained. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling small, inadequate for the magnitude of what he had done. He had not just brought her proof, he had brought her justice. He had chosen her, finally, over his mother. That evening a storm rolled in from the sea. The wind howled, rattling the window panes of Eleanor's small room. Thomas, who had never liked storms, woke from a nightmare, crying out. Eleanor rushed to his side, trying to soothe him, but he was inconsolable, his small body trembling. There was a knock on the door. It was Alistair. He must have heard the crying from his room at the inn. He stood in the doorway, his hair disheveled, concern etched on his face. "Is he all right?" "It's the storm," Eleanor said, her voice strained with worry. "He's terrified." Alistair looked past her at the crying child in the small bed. Without asking for permission, he walked into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed, his presence seeming to fill the small space. "There is no need to be afraid, Thomas," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble that seemed to counter the roar of the wind. "When I was a boy, my father told me that thunder was just the sound of giants bowling in the clouds." Thomas's sobs subsided into hiccups. He looked at Alistair, his gray eyes wide in the lamplight. "Giants?" "Very big ones," Alistair confirmed, a small smile touching his lips. "And they are terrible bowlers, always dropping the balls. That's the rumbling sound you hear." A small giggle escaped Thomas. "Are they?" "Dreadful," Alistair said with mock seriousness. "They always end up in the gutter. And the lightning? That is just the scorekeeper turning on a bright lamp to write down their terrible scores." Thomas giggled again, a real laugh this time. He looked from Alistair to his mother and back again. The fear was gone, replaced by a sleepy curiosity. He snuggled back down under the covers, his eyes drifting shut. Alistair sat there for a long time, just watching his son sleep. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her heart a tangled knot of emotions. She had just witnessed a moment of pure, instinctive fatherhood. He had not used his wealth or his power. He had used kindness, imagination, and a gentle voice to slay his son's dragons. He had not demanded the role of father. He had simply, quietly, inhabited it. When he finally rose and came back to the door, his eyes met hers in the dim light. The space between them was charged, filled with the unspoken words of the last hour. "He called me Mama," she said softly, a statement of fact that held a world of meaning. "All this time, he has been enough for me. I thought I was enough for him, but I cannot. I cannot teach him how to be a man. I cannot teach him about giants who bowl in the clouds." It was a concession, a white flag fluttering over the battlefield of her heart. Alistair reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her face. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch as light as a moth's wing. "You have been more than enough, Eleanor. You have been everything. Let me be something. Let me try." She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, just for a second, a silent surrender to the exhaustion and the reluctant, terrifying flicker of hope. "Stay," she whispered. "The storm is too strong to go back to the inn." He did not sleep in her bed. He slept on a pallet of blankets on the floor at the foot of Thomas's bed, a silent guardian watching over the family he had almost lost forever. In the morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was washed clean, glistening in the pale sunlight, and something inside the small room had been washed clean, too. The anger, the bitterness, had receded, leaving behind the fragile, fertile ground of forgiveness. They did not return to Blackwood immediately. They stayed in Seabrook for another month, a strange transitional period where they learned to be a family. Alistair taught Thomas how to skip stones on the flat, calm sea. Eleanor taught Alistair how to mend a fishing net, his large, clumsy fingers fumbling with the twine, much to Thomas's delight. They ate their meals together at Mrs. Gable's kitchen table. They were not a duke and a duchess. They were Alistair, Elena, and Thomas. One afternoon, Alistair presented Thomas with a new wooden wolf. It was exquisitely carved from a dark, rich wood, its lines sleek and powerful. Thomas looked at it, then at the small, worn wolf his mother had made him. He held one in each hand, his small brow furrowed in concentration. Then, he placed the new wolf next to the old one on the mantelpiece. "Now he has a friend," he declared. Alistair looked at Eleanor over their son's head, and they shared a smile, a real smile. It was a beginning. When they finally returned to Blackwood, it was on Eleanor's terms. She entered the grand house not as a disgraced wife returning with her tail between her legs, but as its rightful mistress. She dismissed the staff who had been loyal to the Dowager Duchess, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. She hired new people, people who looked to her, not to the ghost of Isolde, for instruction. She had the oppressive, heavy velvet curtains taken down, letting sunlight flood the long-darkened rooms. Alistair supported her every move. He was a partner, not a patriarch. He saw the intelligence and strength he had been blind to before, and marveled at it. He had married a girl, but he had fallen in love with the woman she had been forced to become. Their reconciliation was not a sudden, passionate affair. It was a slow, quiet rebuilding of trust, brick by brick. It was shared glances over their son's head at dinner. It was his hand finding hers as they walked in the gardens. It was the night she finally moved from her separate chambers back into the master suite, a silent acknowledgement that the past was no longer a barrier between them. They used their power differently. They established a fund for the village of Seabrook, ensuring the fishermen had the best equipment and that their families would be provided for. They started a school for the children of their tenants. They transformed Blackwood from a symbol of oppressive power into a source of genuine good. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after his return, Alistair found Eleanor and Thomas not in the formal, manicured gardens, but in a wild, overgrown part of the estate near the woods. Eleanor had a trowel in her hand, her face smudged with dirt, and Thomas was gleefully digging for worms. They were planting a new garden, one filled with wildflowers like the ones she used to sell, sea pinks and lavender and cornflowers, a piece of Seabrook, transplanted into the heart of Blackwood. He knelt in the dirt beside her, his fine trousers bedamned. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the faint, faded calluses that were a map of her survival. She no longer sold flowers outside a church. She commanded a great house, a great fortune, and the heart of a duke. But she was still the woman who had found her strength in the soil. "Are you happy, Eleanor?" he asked. The question raw with the vulnerability he now allowed himself to show her. She looked at him, her eyes clear and full of a love that had been earned, not given. She looked at their son, laughing as he held up a wiggling worm for their inspection. The air was fresh and smelled of damp earth and new beginnings, not of stifling perfume and old secrets. "Yes, Alistair," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I am." She squeezed his hand, a simple pressure that spoke of forgiveness, of partnership, of a future they would build together. The gilded cage was gone, its bars melted down and reforged into a foundation, stronger and more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined.